Well, hello, everybody. My name is Elad Gross. I'm a candidate for Missouri Attorney General, and this is going to be a very special episode of the Elad Pod. We'll be talking to Roger Goldman about police licensing and police reforms. We are on the road for the first time today over here in Florissant, so we will be with you very soon. If you're watching right now, make sure to go ahead and comment. Let us know where you're watching from. If you've got any questions at all about this issue, about anything that you see as we're talking, you can go ahead and put those directly in the comments and we'll be able to see them. If you're watching on our website at eladgross.live, there is a phone number to text. That is my cell phone number right here. So you can also text us questions and we'll be sure to get back to you. So if you do have any questions, let us know. If you're there, let us know where you're from and where you're watching from. And if you could, please go ahead and share this video so we can get a whole bunch of folks watching. So we'll be with you in just a couple minutes. Go ahead and share the video in a sec. All right. See if that works. I don't know. All right, everybody, welcome to the Elad Pod. We have a wonderful special guest today. We are on the road. There is an endorsement drive-in meeting here in Florissant, so we wanted to make sure we made that. So we're on the road in the parking lot of the historic Old St. Ferdinand Shrine. And folks are already looking at us because they're wondering why in the world is a camera out here. But the reason is because we have a fantastic town hall for you today. It is with Professor Roger Goldman. He is the nation's expert in police licensing. I've had a wonderful opportunity to talk to him early on in the campaign about potential police reforms, how Missouri's doing, and whether we can expand or how well are we doing already in this area. So I know that this is a very important issue for a lot of us who've been working in the justice area for a long time. So I'm excited to have him on today. If you are there, please go ahead and share the video. Let us know where you're watching from. Sabrina's here from the metropolis of Ozark. Yes, Sabrina, it's great to virtually see you again. But let us know you're here and go ahead and share the video. So let me bring in Roger right now. And Roger, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. Well, thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. If you could, so Roger's done wonderful work in this area. Obviously I'm bringing him on because I think he's got a lot to share. But, I wanted to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to everybody, let them know the work that you have been doing and, why you got involved in all of this in the first place.
Okay, well, one of the reasons I'm the nation's expert, I'm one of the few people very interested in this issue. It's not going to be well known to your viewers, but it's something very important. And a little later on, I'll connect it to the events in Minnesota. But basically, it's a very simple concept, the idea that the state licenses police the way the state licenses social workers, doctors, lawyers, you name it. We just don't think of that role that the state has for police. And the reason I got interested in this topic was that several years ago, 40 years ago, in fact, there was a horrific incident of a police lieutenant who worked in Maplewood and who would have a very bizarre way of trying to get confessions from suspects. And one of the ways was to handcuff the suspect and play Russian roulette. And when he would do it, apparently some of his patrolmen would watch him do it. And even if the gun didn't go off, it was often effective in getting a confession. So unbeknownst to this Lieutenant Cerbello, the two patrolmen played the game with a mentally challenged suspect who was thought to have tried to cash a $40 stolen cashier's check, and the gun did go off, and it killed the young man named Tom Brown. They, of course, were prosecuted later on, but the sad, well, of course, his death was terribly sad, but the fact is that despite that misconduct, Cerbello was hired knowingly by the chief of a small town in North County called Bridgeton Terrace. And even despite the fact that he knew about his prior misconduct, he hired him part-time. But since he worked in Maplewood, it was only a part-time job, he went back one night to Maplewood and saw someone sitting in his car, turned out to be African-American. He assumed that he was going to steal the car. He told him to get out of the car, and the fellow fled, and he shot him in the back and killed him. So I couldn't believe it. I was working with the local ACLU at the time that we did not have a process in Missouri that would have prevented him after that Russian roulette incident from going and getting another job. And that's when I learned about, after doing some extensive research in Florida, the existence of something called a licensing and decertification law. And that motivated me to, and really that's been my life's work ever since, working all over the country, starting with actually in Missouri. And what your viewers may not know is that Missouri has a very strong decertification law. In fact, we are in the top 10 in the country in terms of decertifications. We have decertified, the state of Missouri, 1,000 police officers, meaning they cannot work again in law enforcement in the state again. And that puts us about 9th or 10th in the country. Now, the tie-in to what we've all been witnessing with Minnesota is that Minnesota's law is very weak compared to Missouri, which in the last survey had decertified 53 police officers. In that same survey in 2015, Minnesota had only decertified 2. So the question is, with respect to Chauvin, the officer who killed George Floyd, there were several complaints with the Minneapolis Police Department against him. Only 2 were sustained. And the question that I think we hopefully will know the answer to, were any of those complaints serious enough that they should have led to his lack of decertification in Minnesota? And I told you Minnesota had a very weak law. But if it turns out that he had done something in those 10 complaints that would have given an indication he might do something like this, can you imagine the different result? Right. He would not force that day he confronted Floyd. Yeah. So that's really the tie-in to the importance of this concept of decertification. It's a preventive action, taking people out of just like you do for many other occupations, to prevent future misconduct.
So how does it work? So I mean, it sounds like this is a statewide licensing system. Is that right?
Correct. Every peace officer in Missouri has to be licensed by the state post, Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission. It's part of the Department of Public Safety. There's an obligation of chiefs to turn in people if they've committed a decertifiable offense, if they suspect that. And then there's a hearing before an administrative hearing officer in Jeff City, and the sanction, which can be anywhere from probation to suspension, and the ultimate one is decertification, removing your license, actually, it's removal. That's up to the head of the Department of Public Safety. And so those numbers of 1,000, I think would be surprising to your audience, that Missouri is one of the best processes in the country.
Yeah, no, that's so where you're talking about an administrative process. So I mean, I guess it sounds like there's certainly due process involved in that. What does that look like here in Missouri?
Well, again, think of so many other occupations that I assume the Attorney General may staff some of those.
Right.
That is, right. You have a hearing. It's not an individual complaint filed, but it's up to the chiefs to turn it in. But if a newspaper reporter has a story, I'm always sending things to the State Post to say to the folks there, have you heard about this case? Because the Director of Public Safety himself can initiate the proceeding. So, of course, there's due process, a right of appeal. It goes before this administrative hearing officer, the question for him is, did the police officer commit a decertifiable offense as defined in the statute? And in Missouri, the statute includes like abuse of citizen, sexual misconduct, which is very, very common. My first study in Florida showed that the great majority of officers who we decertified there involved driving while female, arresting a woman who may have had a lot of points towards losing the license, and then say, let's have sex, and that, of course, leads to many, many decertifications. I got the AP to do a series of stories a few years ago, and over a 5-year period, 1,000 officers around the country were decertified for that type of sexual misconduct. Many involved minors, trafficked young girls who the officer believed would never be believed, or even equally horrific, victims of crime. A woman who claims the husband, assaulted her, raped her. The officer comes by and consoling her, and then has sex with her. So it's a variety of things can result in decertification. And Missouri has a very broad statute that, as I say, has been very effective. About 30,000 officers nationally have lost their license, which most people are unaware of.
Does every state have this?
So what's interesting is when I teach criminal procedure, I always ask my law students, after describing what that process is, guess which states don't have it. And you can imagine the answer: Mississippi, Alabama, and guess the states that in fact don't have it: California, Hawaii, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island. And I ask the students, why do you think those very progressive blue states don't have it? Anybody in the audience want to give me an answer? I'll play law professor here.
Yeah, right. Get some input. If anybody's got guesses, put it in the comments.
Any guesses?
Yeah.
Well, time clicks. The clock is running out. Yeah. Police unions, very opposed to it, even though.
Someone got it. Linda Smith got it. Just so you know.
Yeah, Linda, you get the award.
There you go.
You get and in fact, if you ask a police a union, why would you be opposed to something like decertifying people for, abusive force, sexual misconduct, perjury? And the answer always is, well, I'm for getting rid of those people, but it's hard to run for union office on a platform of more regulation.
Yeah.
So if you're going to expand in a lot of states that do have it, I told you the states that don't, it's a very, very weak law. Because in, say, Illinois, they only decertify if the person has been convicted of a crime. But think about other professions here. Is a barber only decertified or loses license if he is convicted of a crime, or a lawyer? No. So the commission of misconduct, and that's why Missouri's law is so good, can result in loss of license, just as conviction of felonies and certain serious misdemeanors.
So in Missouri, you mentioned municipalities in the St. Louis area. You were a professor at St. Louis University. We've got a lot of them in this area. I'm in one right now. We hear stories of officers who were in one municipality, might have gotten terminated there, moved to another one, and were able to find jobs there. How does the decertification process play in that kind of a movement from one municipality to the other?
Well, it's a wonderful question, because I didn't go back to tell you who was the main person to testify that we got this bill through back in 1988. It was Clarence Harmon. Your audience might remember him, chief of police, mayor of St. Louis. But when I worked with him and the ACLU, he was internal affairs of the city. And when he testified in Jefferson City, and I was there, that very question was asked. And he said in 90% of the cases, when he had to let an officer go, fired from St. Louis, or the officer resigned under fire, within a week he'd be working for one of those small departments. And in fact, Breckenridge Terrace Bridgeton Terrace was one of those small departments. So that's absolutely a problem. There's a term for it called municipal shuffle. Mm-hmm. And after the Ferguson event several years ago, a group out of Washington called PERF, Police Executive Research Foundation, came in and discovered how common that problem was. But again, we've decertified 1,000 people in the 88. It's not to say, in fact, then auditor Clara McCaskill found out that, in fact, some of these departments weren't cooperating with the Post and weren't sending in the name. So it's still a problem, but we are so much better off than we were. But you're absolutely right. That was, and this is true all over the country. Pittsburgh, any place with a lot of small departments, are tempted to hire someone like the Breckenridge Bridgeton Terrace did, because that's a community that's not small but has very little resources, no tax base to speak of. And if you're trying to have a police department there, how are you going to raise the money? You don't have much money, so you're willing to hire somebody who has their license from the state, so they've been through training, and wink at or ignore the previous misbehavior because somebody once said it's the economy, stupid. Mm-hmm. We don't have to pay their salary while they're going through training. We don't have to pay their training. We've got a live body. But it's a problem not just here but all over. But at least we've taken a step forward. Not to say we can do better, but you're absolutely right. That was the origin of why we even got the law through in the first place.
Yeah. Well, folks who are listening, I know we've got a few more who jumped on. If you've got any questions, we are monitoring those. Go ahead and put those in the comments. Okay, so we've talked about, Missouri has taken a big step forward with certification and making sure that we can revoke licenses, giving officers due process and everything else. What would you say we should still be doing? What improvements should we make to this process or to others for accountability within police departments?
Okay. Well, first of all, the states, as I said, Missouri has been extraordinarily effective, again, with your point, not perfect, with respect to law enforcement officers. But many states, specifically Georgia and Florida, have extended their post to have jurisdiction over corrections officers. In fact, in Florida, the last survey in 2015, 3 times the number of corrections officers were decertified or lost their license as compared to law enforcement officers. So I think we ought to expand the occupations that are covered by the post, because I would say all criminal justice officers, because they have the power over people, especially in prisons especially, and sexual abuse is quite common. But Missouri, I don't even think, and this is something that you could probably tell me, that we even have any jail standards or any mandatory training for county sheriffs, county deputies. That's definitely something we think we need to look at, and post would be the place to house that, give them jurisdiction over that.
Yeah, I totally agree, and that's actually something that I've been talking about quite a bit on the campaign in terms of trying to using the Attorney General's office to bring best practices to allow places that oftentimes don't have the resources. It's really easy not to have accountability when, maybe your department's very small and no one's really paying too much attention. But in the world now, it's a lot easier to do that, especially with the technology that we've got all around us.
Right. And you really do raise another point of what I'd like to see. As your viewers are going to know, if a school district is failing, you can lose accreditation. If a police department is failing, you ought to be able to lose the accreditation for that department. That's another bill that I'd like to see get through. Is who would take over law enforcement, but if those are the 2 most important things that a local, municipality has to do: education and policing. And a couple of states now have started to talk about decertification of departments rather than individual officers.
Yeah, that's. What would that look like? Because we've had, in our state, in different places in St. Louis, we've had, districts that have lost accreditation. And, that's started putting into effect some other laws, allowed transfers this way and the other. What would, because there's always this kind of debate, and I hear it in education a lot where folks are saying, well, if you do a bad thing, we're going to take money away. Whereas other folks are saying, well, if you're not doing so well, maybe we need to put more money in. What's kind of, I guess, when you look at policing or even corrections, but the justice system as a whole, what do you think about that situation where you've got kind of these two competing theories about how to fix the problem?
Yeah, no, it's really a great question. And but if you had a department that let's take a department that was actually taken over by a crime syndicate, you know, it just hypothetically,
Sure.
And would you say to that department they should still be in charge of of policing? But who's going to take over is a very good practical question. But sometimes, like police departments, St. Louis County took over, I believe, Jennings policing.
Okay.
So maybe the county has to do it. But at some point, when things get so bad, we do have to think about that.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely right, politically difficult. And my guess is the Post really wouldn't want to take this on. But if things get really bad, we need to think about some creative alternatives.
It's really, it's almost like a receivership kind of control. I mean, in St. Louis City, up until 2013, St. Louis City was under, the police department was actually under state control, and then there was a big fight for local control. That same issue right now is cropping up again in Kansas City, because, there's protests going on there. Mayor Quentin Lucas is out there. I've been in contact with him quite a bit too, and watching what's happening. I've been sitting on meetings with the police board and community members. But it's interesting because Kansas City, and it's one of the biggest cities in the country that still is under state control, does not have local control. There's a lot of talk about that from their city council because their ability to control what's happening locally is very limited. So it's kind of almost, trying to figure out what the best situation is, given whatever the particular circumstances are. Because I'm sure in some places having maybe that kind of receivership situation could be really beneficial, like in the example that you gave, whereas in others, like right now in Kansas City, they are dying for more control in order to be able to implement more policy reforms and whatever there might be on the local level.
Those are great points, but I guess my point is if things get really bad, we need to think of solutions. Right. And by the way, another problem nationally is we have 18,000 state, local, and county law enforcement agents. If you were in England or France or any other Western democracy, they would say that's crazy. We've taken federalism way too far. As you know, we have tiny little departments. What kind of management can they have? What kind of chiefs? What kind of training? So, I agree it's an extreme solution, but we need to be talking about this as part of the alternatives.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's it's a good proposal, especially in situations where it has gotten out of hand, and unfortunately that's happening in quite a few places. I know we talked a little bit about this, and then there's a good question in there too. I'm going to bring on the screen from Tahara, which I haven't seen you forever. We talked about federalism a bit. And how the certification process right now is very state by state. Do you think that there should be a national database for certification for police officers?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I would call it a softball question because some of your viewers may know that President Obama set up a task force on 21st century policing. They came up with a lot of recommendations, and my favorite recommendation was recommendation 2.15, which recommended that the Department of Justice set up a national decertification index so that if an officer is decertified in one state and tries to get certified in another, that information will be available. Currently, the federal government, through the Department of Health and Human Services, has such a data bank on healthcare professionals who have been sanction imposed on them, like loss of license, suspension, malpractice judgment, or settlement, so that if that doctor or nurse tries to go to another state, the federal government has this database. And so I advocated in an article I wrote for Police Chief Magazine, and the task force picked up on that the Department of Justice ought to do it. As I like to say, if the feds do it for docs, why not for cops?
It was a
they both
question.
have immense power over us. I think when there's going to be a lot of discussion of that already, some of you may have seen that Julian Castro's come out for that, the Congressional Black Caucus, and there are debates this week that a lot of bills on police misconduct are going to be introduced, and my guess is that will be part of the mix.
Yeah. We actually had some folks from here in Missouri who are on that task force. Rasheen Aldridge, who's now a state representative and is leading a protest as we speak right now, was a member, he's certainly taken a lot of these issues to Jefferson City and has been advocating quite a bit for more accountability for a long time. It's unfortunate that we had Ferguson happen here. Obviously, we've had a lot of events happen before that. Unfortunately, we've had quite a few happen after, and there's been some progress made. We had a whole Ferguson Commission report. Unfortunately, not too much of it has been implemented, and we'll have a podcast on that too. You all want to pay attention to that one. That will be a good one. But yeah, for me, it's just so frustrating for all the folks who've been working so hard on this and all the folks who've been subjected to this to see how long it's taken to make some significant changes and how really little has changed in so many places. That just, it's unfortunate because it really delegitimizes a lot of what our government's doing, and a lot of people lose faith in it, and we have less participation as a result. So,
well, one of the positive things coming out of these recent demonstrations, though, is something I've always believed in, which is progressive chiefs and sheriffs. They are there, are very, very interested in this improvement because it doesn't help them to have terrible officers on their force. So that's why when I was with the ACLU and we got this bill through, I worked very closely with folks in the state legislature, with police people like Clarence Harmon. So it's one of those issues and you've seen chiefs marching with demonstrators. So it can be done. But you've got to anticipate that unions will be opposed.
Yeah, I think, and we're actually seeing that play out quite a bit right now here. It's been great. I think, having participated in this for a good long time now, I think you're totally right. What's been really positive to see is so many, especially police chiefs and those in administration, coming out in support of what's happening right now. That's something that we really didn't see just a few years ago. In Audrain County, over Mexico, Missouri, the sheriff there was all about it and was demanding accountability. And I don't know if that's something. I think it's a really positive step in the right direction in a lot of ways. So I totally agree with what you just said. So
yeah, I think that some sheriffs have indicated they would be in favor of having posts do the training. I didn't even mention that's another big. That's the big job of the post for. Corrections officers in the county jails to be trained by posts. So I think your viewers would be surprised to realize there's goodwill on both sides. I should have mentioned, too, that it was Republican Governor John Ashcroft who signed the very good Missouri law in 1988 into law.
Yeah, it really should not be a partisan issue. It should be something that we can all really come together. I've talked to a number of law enforcement officers. I've been talking to the Ethical Society of Police, which is a predominantly black police union in St. Louis City. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of segregation even within the police unions, and we talked about that a bit too. But they've been calling for accountability for a long time, and on a whole lot of other issues, reform. This is a question from Tahara. I'm going to put this up on the screen. So she's asking, are there any police trainings of racial profiling and bias and how to handle and approach a citizen with mental health disorders? There is. And, I actually had the opportunity to sit in on what's called CIT training, which is Crisis Intervention Team Training. I was invited to come out by a former officer who has dedicated really the rest of his career to making sure that folks are getting higher quality training. Has really been pushing for that, and I actually got to sit in through one of those trainings where they talked about cultural competency, understanding when somebody might not be able to communicate in the same way that you might, whether that's a language barrier or maybe there are some mental health challenges there, how to de-escalate those situations. And one of the most important and impactful things of that whole class period that I was in, two things. One was the conversation around mental health, not only from when you encounter somebody who's going through a crisis, but recognizing those issues within yourself as the officer, because the last thing that you want is to be unstable in what can be a very, very itself unstable situation. So that was a big thing. And the other thing that really surprised me was I sat through it, and at the end, the former officer who brought me in, said, "Did you think it was worthwhile?" And I said, "Oh, absolutely. I'm so happy that the officers are getting this. I didn't know this was a thing." And he said, "Well, it's not mandatory. It is something that folks are volunteering to do, and unfortunately, some departments are more favorable to it, others aren't." And so, yeah, I think that certainly with training, we can do a whole lot better. I just wish that training was available to a lot more officers.
Right.
Yeah.
Let me stop you there because post recently, maybe after Ferguson, now requires, I think, yearly training on de-escalation, racial profiling, and it should add CIT. I mean, a lot of states are doing that. So that's another valuable point, and every officer has to go through that training.
Yeah. I think, yeah. It's just, and in some departments, unfortunately, it can often be a department by department issue there. But it is good that there's a baseline standard for that through post. Right. It's just unfortunately, there are some departments that don't treat those trainings as responsibly as others. It's really impressive to walk into a police department and see folks who are taking that very seriously. On the flip side, it's very sad to see the opposite of that, and unfortunately, it isn't uncommon. But there's studies right now looking into how to best train folks on implicit bias and what the best ways to do that are. We're trying to improve that all the time right now.
Yeah. By the way, I did teach the police academy a couple of years, and just a little story about that. Law professor coming in, the person I replaced, he gave me his card, and his expertise was in defensive bicycle tactics. So not only is the question of, what are the subject matter, who's doing the teaching too, and then how serious is it taken?
You're exactly right. Yeah, you're exactly right. So I mean, obviously training is going to be a very important piece of this, and then figuring out what's the most effective for folks is going to be the other side of that. So I mean, in Minnesota, I know you mentioned that there are folks, when you look at different states and you compare them to, I guess, what's the difference that you see when somebody is, or when a state is implementing these decertifications at a higher rate, or maybe is that implemented better? Like, what are you seeing the differences in the different states having these decertification processes?
So that is really a great question. And by the way, that's the favorite question of reporters. Professor Goldman, could you tell us that states that have a very active decertification program have fewer incidents of police misconduct? Now, the good thing, my first answer is I'm just a law professor. You need to ask that to an empirical social science researcher, which is kind of a cop-out. But the other thing I say is, would we ask that question? Is it a good idea to take away the license of doctors who take out the wrong kidney? Can you show us that a state that does do that, they have better doctors? We don't ask that with other professions. I'm not saying it's not a legitimate question, but it just gets to the point we don't think of police as, in a way, being a profession. But of course it is. Look at the power to search, to seize, to enter into your home, to use deadly force. And we ought to be treating those folks at the highest level and just the way we do other professions that we would never ask, should we, what's the result of a state that, that takes away the license of a lot of doctors. So, but it's a great question. And if you can answer the question, don't run for AG. You'd make a lot of money if you answer.
A lot of people have been telling me that. What are you doing? You can make a lot of money doing something else. But
well, not money, but it'd be very worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely right. I mean, that's that would help quite a few people. Hey, you know what? Maybe we'll start a research division. I've talked about that a little bit too, a little research division at the Attorney General's office too. So, let's see. Oh, this is a great question. Just came in, and Natalie, I'll come back to yours too, but I'm going to get this one. Initial certification requirements, high school, and sometimes in some accelerated academies, it can take just a few months. before you are an officer in many situations. So, what, I mean, what are your views on that? Do you think that there needs to be any reform in those situations?
Okay, so the states are all over the place on that. Uh, Minnesota, which told you is so terrible on the decertification side, is the only state that requires college credits before you can enter. Many states at the entry level will disqualify you if, for example, you've had a bad conduct discharge from the armed services. One of the issues is with respect to disqualifications for certain misdemeanors. Does that have an impact on minority folks who may have been entrapped or minor drug offenses, especially now since possession is not really one. So there's some. I think we do need to look at these sort of automatic disqualifiers that have just sort of stayed in the law. But it's a great question. Yes, there typically are disqualifiers. But high school tends to be enough. And when I taught in the police academy, I had several people who had graduate degrees becoming police officers. But it's a good question because Philadelphia, I think, used to require college and they stopped it. That would be another interesting research project. Can we show that if you've had, you've gotten older, you've had college, you turn out to be a better police officer? There are just so many empirical questions that a law professor like me can't answer, but your audience might be able to.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's a really good thing to look at to make sure, that folks are, they're trained and they know what they're doing. And especially if you get folks who might be a little bit younger and you're just kind of giving them a badge and going, that could certainly be an issue. So,
and you know what that reminds me of? There's a big debate now in what is the role of what makes a good police officer. We used to think of the training tapes would show you're the warrior, but now the talk is you're the guardian, and that's a big debate. Those two. What are we looking for in an officer? And the warrior mentality, that's the person, a hotshot out of high school may not be as good as someone who wants to protect and serve, who is the guardian. Big debate now in the police profession.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She's Well, I do know Heather Taylor. She is definitely a great person to talk to about issues like this, and I'm sure she's going to tell Natalie to ask her that question. Yeah, and I would add to it as well as people who speak a different language. How do we handle it as well?
My mic off for a second. So I'm going to recap just in case my mic was off, and I'm sorry about that. But yeah, the CIT training that I was talking about before does deal a lot with folks who are hearing impaired, also folks with different language barriers. So I'm going to ask. I'll see if we can get somebody from that program to come on too and talk about it a bit. But Heather Taylor might have some insight there as well. So. Well, this has been really helpful. I mean, we got through a lot of the questions here, and I know they're moving some stuff around. Might get a little noisy back here. We are on site. This is really exciting for those of you who are tuning in late. This is our first one on site. It's also our first one with Roger Goldman here, so I really appreciate you doing this. Is there any, I guess, given the situation that we're in now, a lot of us are hoping for some pretty significant change in our justice system. We've highlighted some things that are going well, even in Missouri. I know sometimes it's hard when you're in the middle of that to see it, but we've got some good programs going and some good legislation already. Obviously, we can improve a lot of things. But is there something that you would stress for folks to really look for, to really look to as we're making these changes moving forward?
Well, I do think, given the fact that when you see chiefs marching with marchers and supporting, saying that it was just outrageous what Chauvin had done, that we've had a terrible situation, but I'm pretty hopeful that folks who haven't come together in the past might be able to. So, my wife accused me of being too much of an optimist, but hopefully, I mean, we did not get this law through in Missouri, but for the fact that we had this horrific Russian roulette situation. Mm-hmm. So never let a crisis like this go to waste.
Yeah.
Take advantage, and hopefully things will get better.
Right. I mean, so many folks have suffered, and we really cannot let that memory not be something that pushes us forward to do something better. So, I absolutely agree. Well, I really appreciate you coming on and you doing it on such short notice. We should have you back as we kind of progress through all of this. You were super informative, and obviously you are the expert on all of this stuff too, so that's great. But yeah, I really appreciate you coming. I hope it was helpful for you. You did a good job with the law school class question. Even you got some people responding. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
Happy to do it.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to outro some folks, and then I'll keep you on for just a second. But folks, thank you so much for showing up. We are going to be back on live again on Saturday. Saturday, we are going to have Chris Arnadi. He is the author of Dignity, photojournalist who actually did a lot of work in looking at class in America. On Monday, we are going to have Josh Gondelman. We just got to announce that one today. Josh Gondelman is a comedian. He's written for a whole bunch of stuff, including John Oliver's show. So we're going to talk about comedy and change with him. I've already mentioned we're going to have Heather Taylor on Tuesday, and we are then going to have another town hall that evening with a wonderful candidate for state representative, Sydney Slimp, over in the Springfield area. So you can tune into all of that stuff. We've got all of the stuff up on the website. We're always on the social media. You all are finding us already. So we really appreciate you coming. You can find all of this information anytime. I'll put up the website so you can all see it at eladgross.org. For those of you who are out there and you really want to have input into how our justice system is working, you can also go to that website. We have a new project right now called Our Missouri Justice Initiative, which is asking for folks to really give your input on what you've seen in the justice system, what you'd like to see change, and we'd love to hear from you too. So you can go again to that website. Right there on the front, you'll see give your opinion on the justice system. Click that button and we'll take you right there. So thank you all for showing up. Thank you all for being here, and we will see you soon. And thank you so much again to Roger Goldman for being here. Make sure to share the video and let your folks know. So thank you all. We'll see you soon.